Welcome back to Matt and Eric Talk Twins. My name's Matt, here with my co-host Eric.
How are we doing this lovely week?
We're doing all right. We have some actual Twins news to talk about for the first time on this pod. So we'll get into that. A few interesting roster decisions, two trades, and then we have some other news and notes generally about the Twins and some moves around the league. Then, as a fun little side topic, while we wait for the winter to really get underway, we have a brief history on deferrals and how we expect that to change or look going forward. So, first off, we can go over some of the actual news and notes we have so far. The big one, and I think what came as a shock to both of us, was Trevor Larnach being tendered a contract a couple weeks ago. I think we had both written him off. I know in our last episode of the podcast, even, we had said there's really no situation where Larnach fits on this roster next year. Instead, the Twins didn't trade him. They didn't non-tender him. Looks like they're going to give him $5 million, and he'll probably be on the roster next year. So what are your thoughts on that?
And after all that, he still has no place on this roster, and it is no more clear both what the Twins' direction is for this offseason, but even just what they're going to do with Trevor Larnach in general. I think it says a lot when you have your own beat writers, Dan Hayes and Aaron Gleeman, absolutely wonderful writers, going out of their way to also discuss how surprised they were about the Trevor Larnach contract being tendered. If even the guys who are connected to the team and talking about them every day get surprised by a move like that, you know it's a questionable one.
Yeah, I think Aaron Gleeman really hit the nail on the head. A few hours after Trevor Larnach got tendered, Gleeman posted something where I think 20% of the Twins' 40-man roster is left-handed hitting outfielders or first basemen. And that's without Walker Jenkins, who's also a left-handed hitting outfielder and will be on the 40-man this season. So, I mean, it's just insane. A crazy way to structure your roster. I would also argue Trevor Larnach's the lowest upside of all of those options and probably not even close to the lowest or the highest floor.
And to me, that is the real issue with bringing him back. It's not that he's like going to tank our season. It's not that he's just an absolutely terrible teammate. There's just no world in which this makes sense for the Twins. It doesn't fit the criteria of a team that's trying to sell, downsize, and build for the future, because he's, even still after being tendered this year, not likely to be part of that future. But it also doesn't fit the bill of a team trying to reorganize and restructure in a way where they can win now, because Trevor Larnach has not produced a lot of winning baseball so far as a Minnesota Twin.
I'll also say I think our thoughts on Larnach really circle back to what I always thought was a weird approach that they took at the deadline, where they acquired a lot of outfielders despite having upper minors outfield prospects that they want to get playing time in Jenkins and Erod. But they also brought in uh, James Outman. They brought in Alan Roden. They brought in Hendry Mendez, who's going to be in AAA this year. They brought in a bunch of left-handed hitting outfielders, which is fine. But when you already have left-handed hitting outfielders and you have other left-handed hitting outfielders that are coming up, what do you do with all these guys? Like if Trevor Larnach was a first baseman, I would be perfectly happy with Larnach on this roster. I'd be like, he's going to be a league average bat. There's a little bit of upside for more. He doesn't have to do a whole lot defensively. Perfect. But Trevor Larnach, the outfielder, when you have all these other options, doesn't make any sense to me.
I do wonder if that is something that we could see changing as this offseason shapes up. I believe it was Gleeman that mentioned the Twins don't really sound like they're trying to bring in another first baseman right now. It kind of oddly sounds like Cody Clemens is going to have first crack at that job come spring training. And if that's the case, there just simply has to be another player, whether that's Larnach or somebody else in the organization, that they expect to be able to contribute day one at first base. And if that's not Trevor Larnach at this point, I don't really have anybody off the top of the head outside of Eddie Julian, and that's another name that I thought was never going to be seeing the light of day for the Twins again.
Yeah, I also thought that those Falvey quotes were really interesting because he said, and I'm paraphrasing here, but he said something to the effect of Cody Clemens has done a lot of good things for us. He's a great player, and he's the kind of guy that we want to give a long runway to see what he can do at first base. And then he also said something to the effect of, we have some right handed hitting compliments that we think could really help that position this year coming up. And it's like, well, okay, who are your right-handed hitting first basemen? Are you referring to like Kyler Fedko, Anthony Prado, guys that you didn't give any playing time? Like you had the worst roster in the big leagues in the second half, and you didn't feel like calling them up then. But now next year, when you're theoretically trying to contend, you're like, this guy could be the short side of a platoon. Like that doesn't make any sense. And so I think that's really, I don't know. It just, I feel like they don't have a plan at first, and they're just trying to sell us on Cody Clemens because it's the only option currently.
What really gets me about all of those comments from Falvey, though, is that we already had a long runway for Clemens to display his abilities last year, and it was all right. It was a 1.2 WAR season. He got hot sometimes. He almost hit 20 homers. There were weeks where you were like, "Oh my God, where did Cody Clemens come from?" But by and large, he was available into the early part of the season for a reason, and B just did not do anything with that runway that he was given last year, and I don't really understand why they could even pretend that things are going to be different this upcoming season if they just run him out in the same capacity.
Yeah, I mean he was worth, like you said, 1.2 WAR last year. Right now, Fangraphs, their steamer projections, which again, I'm not a huge fan of steamer projections, but they have Cody Clemens projected to play 86 games and be worth half of a win with a WRC plus of 98. So they project our current everyday starting first baseman to be 2% below average at the plate. And of note, the other first baseman they have on this list is Eddie Julian, who they project to have a 99 WRC plus and be worth 0.6 WAR. So, I mean, God, if those are our two options, there's no hope for contending. Like if we're going to say this is what our first base situation is going to be, I think we're kidding ourselves if we think they're going to be a playoff team, and they can be. We talked about in depth in our last episode how we think that there's still the core there to make a run. But if they don't make an addition at first base, and if Falvey's serious about playing Cody Clemens every day, I don't have any faith that they're going to be a good team.
I think the most surprising part of all of that is both Clemens and Julian being projected for a below league average WRC plus and still somehow being projected for a positive WAR total. I would not expect either of those guys, who are not exactly known for their defense at a position that largely doesn't care about defense in the first place, to have any sort of value if they're not going to at least be able to push those batting numbers north of 100.
I will say, WAR is based on like the average AAA player, so like a player that you could get for absolutely no cost. Essentially, what Cody Clemens was when the Twins picked him up. And WRC Plus is based off of a league average hitter, and so league average major leaguers will be better than a replacement level AAA player. So I mean, it kind of makes sense, but still underwhelming. Also of note, generally, if you are a winning team, you want all of your regulars, all of your starters to be 2 WAR or higher. Usually, like a 2 WAR player is like an everyday starter. And then 3 to 4 WAR, maybe up to 5, is like this guy's an above average player, maybe an all star. 6 to 10 WAR, it's like this guy could be an MVP in a peak season. The Twins currently have 4 players projected at least 2 WAR, and all of them are below 3 WAR. So we have 4 projected like starting caliber players and none of them are projected to be anything more than just fine starters.
That can't include our pitching staff, then, does it?
No, this is just position players.
All right, that makes more sense. And there's just really no arguing that. It's not like you can say that the projections are bullshit, that they're underwhelming, that they are not really favoring the Twins, because both past production and future expected outcome would agree with exactly what we're seeing out of these projections.
Yeah. Also, on the pitching side, we have two players projected at least 2 WAR, and it's Pablo Lopez and Joe Ryan. So potentially none if those two get traded. I will say there's a bunch of guys who fall like just below that. Sebby Matthews, Taj Bradley, Bailey Ober. They're all right around, but still, I mean, very underwhelming. Yeah, I think we can transition away from first base. We talked about it at length in our last episode, and I think really we're just in a wait and see kind of situation. Another thing that we talked about is the bullpen, and the main. We have two main moves here. The Twins tendered a contract to Justin Topa, which I think was somewhat of a surprise after they declined his club option. And then they also swung a minor trade with the Rays to bring in Eric Orze, who's, I believe, a 28-year-old right-handed pitcher, kind of a guy who had a good season last year, right around 3 ERA, but just kind of mediocre strikeout numbers, walks a few too many guys, doesn't get a ton of ground balls, got a lot of strikeouts in the minors, but just kind of a run-of-the-mill middle reliever. So what are your thoughts, Eric, on Orze and Topa?
To me, this is how you get through a rebuilding season. These are both veteran guys that have experience under their belt, so you know generally what you're going to get in terms of leadership and clubhouse behavior, and you also know what you're going to get on and off the field. And there's a reason that they're both available to the Twins, and I guess at least neither of them really had the choice to come back to Minnesota, but in both cases, that screams to me, hey, these guys will throw innings, and they will probably do so in a manner that we can at least justify keeping them on the roster all year. No part of this sounds, once again, like the Twins are trying to be anything close to competitive in 2026.
Yeah, and I mean, guys like Orze, I feel like are good players for the Twins to target. Right now, the baseline of their bullpen is so low that they just need anyone who can be a serviceable big league reliever. And Eric Orze has at least shown that he can do that. I mean, currently he's probably slotted to be our fourth highest leverage reliever, and we traded a 16th round pick, a like 24-year-old reliever in A ball to get him. So moves like this, I don't have a problem with. The problem is if you're only making moves like this, you're not going to have a competitive enough bullpen to really be in wild card contention.
Yeah, it's a bleak situation to be in, but it's one that I think a lot of us are really already getting ready to settle into, and it's, I think, something that we're going to be talking about a lot in the coming year.
Yeah, that is for sure. Hopefully, we'll have some more reasons for optimism in the bullpen coming up. I'm still holding out hope that they're going to bring in some relief options.
And that extent, I guess I do appreciate what Topa and Orze bring, because they, on the flip side of being very dependable relievers that you can drag through an entire season and not feel terrible about, they're also both guys that you could just cut on a dime if something or somebody comes up and forces your hand, and you wouldn't feel bad about doing that either.
Also, in a normal year, I would really like the Orze acquisition because he does still have options. And so he could be the guy that we've kind of seen Funderburk be the last few years, where he's up and down from AAA. So if in a normal year with a normal bullpen, if he was your 9th, 10th option and he's your shuttle guy back and forth to St. Paul, perfectly happy with that. But the problem is that now Funderburk's our third highest leverage reliever and Orze's our fourth highest leverage. And these are guys who are probably best suited in AAA.
All right, over under 5 save opportunities for Eric Orze this season.
Over. He had 3 saves with the Rays last year.
I feel like the Rays are going to be in a similar situation, not in a similar situation, but using their bullpen in a similar manner to what the Twins will end up doing this year, where it's a lot of just whoever is the healthiest arm, the freshest arm, and a general platoon matchup out of the bullpen.
Yeah, I could definitely see that. The other big, well, I say big, but it's really not a big acquisition.
Big
Is
in Twins land.
Yeah, it's Alex Jackson, who they picked up from the Orioles. They traded the opposite of big, like 5'6" infielder Peyton Eels to pick him up for the pleasure of paying him $1.8 million this year. Alex Jackson, former first round pick, was a pretty highly thought of prospect. He's still a good defender. He has a cannon for an arm, but the bat has just never really come around. I did see a very interesting piece from Parker Hageman at Twins Daily where he talked about some of the mechanical changes that Alex Jackson's made with his swing and how we can see it bear out in the numbers where it's things like his average exit velo, his barrel rate, and his launch angle are all trending in the right direction. And we saw that in the big leagues this past year where he posted a WRC plus right around 110. Granted, in a small sample size, only about 100 at bats for the Orioles, but he also hit well in AAA. So there's at least some hope that Alex Jackson could tap into some of his prospect pedigree, use these new changes to his swing to be a non-abysmal hitter, and the defense is pretty solid to go with it.
To me, if you're a Twins fan, this is a move out of everything we've discussed so far to, I guess, get the most excited about for a lot of the reasons Matt just laid out. There's something you could see there where you look at him and believe that production could be on the way, that he could potentially be better than what we ended up acquiring him for, which I think is really ironic because this is also the piece that I expect to see the least this season. The Twins have already been very outright in saying that they're ready for Ryan Jeffers to take on a lion's share of the catching duty, that instead of the 60-40, even if that bled into more of a 70-30 split we saw between Jeffers and Vasquez, by the end of last year, it sounds like Jeffers might just be rocking 80-85% of those games behind the plate so long as he's healthy, which makes this kind of a disappointing move even as the most exciting one of the offseason so far.
Yeah, I will say I think I'm not upset about this move, especially because Jackson's controllable. So if he does play well this year, you have a couple more years of him, which is especially relevant with Ryan Jeffers being a free agent after this season. If Alex Jackson can at least be a serviceable player, he could maybe be a low end regular. And right now, Fangraphs is projecting the combination of Jeffers and Jackson to be worth about 3 WAR this next year. So it's a strong position group for the Twins. At least relative to the rest of their roster. So I'm feeling pretty good about that setup. And also, I think one thing to kind of, I think the reason that I have optimism for Alex Jackson, maybe more so than the relievers, is because of what we're used to at the position versus what we'll have this season. So we're used to the Twins having a really good bullpen with John Duran and Griffin Jacks and Brock Stewart and all these high octane dominant arms. And so going from that to Eric Orze, big downgrade. We've had 3 years of Christian Vasquez being our backup catcher. Now having a guy who can at least have the potential to be a decent-ish hitter as well as a good defender is a giant upgrade and upside. And so I think it's just relative to like what we've seen recently.
I do have one more addition on this Alex Jackson edition. I have been thinking about what it means a little bit for at least this season, and I think the fact that the Twins brought in a guy that's generally going to be viewed as a lower end backup and a guy that the Twins have already declared that they view as a lower end backup. I wonder if this signals the Twins packing it up on any sort of Jeffers trade talks and deciding that he's just going to be their guy. Maybe they re-sign him after the season. I would find it unlikely, but at the least, if they don't make another meaningful catching addition, I would be stunned to see Jeffers moved even at the deadline.
Yeah, I agree. Although I will say, if the Twins don't think they're going to be contending, they can always pick up some veteran catcher, even in spring training, to just be their backup. And so I don't think we can ever like fully rule it out. But I agree. I feel like Jeffers is very important to the Twins right now if they have any hope of competing this year. And I don't know that they'll get a significant enough trade offer to make it worthwhile completely punting on this year out of the gates.
No, I certainly agree, and just expanding on that too, there's only so low that you can really reach as a team. I think that the Twins already dismantled a lot of the morale and a lot of the leadership in the clubhouse at the deadline last year. There's been a lot of talks that that's going to continue to happen into this offseason. We'll get to that in a little bit as well. But I think that at some point, a guy like Ryan Jeffers, even if you don't resign him after this year, carries some values just being a veteran, being a stable presence in the clubhouse, a guy that a lot of these younger pitchers have already worked with extensively and will benefit from continuing to work with the same catcher in the same role for at the very least this year. And I feel like Ryan Jeffers is kind of at that point where whatever value you're going to pick up in a trade, is it really worth it to not only dismantle but then stomp on the pieces of the leadership and culture that might be left in Minnesota?
Yeah, Ryan Jeffers is also just a big vibes guy. Like if you ever watch any of his post game interviews, he's a fun personality. So personally, I would love to see Jeffers stick around. I think he's a really interesting guy to follow. And I think he's the kind of player that it makes sense to keep around even through a rebuild. But obviously, like with only 1 year left before free agency, at some point you have to maximize his value. But I think there's an argument to be made that his value is maximized on this team for this year. So changing gears a little bit, we talked about tearing down the roster. We spent a bunch of time in the last few episodes talking about the pitcher side of things. But one potential trade that we haven't really given a lot of thought to is Byron Buxton. Now, the reason we haven't talked about it a whole lot is Buxton, after the deadline, was very open about wanting to stay in Minnesota. He called himself a Twin for life. And he was very enthusiastic about his love for the Twins and wanting to be here for the rest of his career. Now, at the beginning of the offseason, we did hear that someone from his camp was saying that he would be willing to be traded. He'd be willing to waive his no trade clause if he thought the Twins were going to further tear down their roster. So it sounds like he wants to be in Minnesota, but if we're not going to be winning, maybe he reconsiders. Well, that's interesting because this week, Jeff Passan of ESPN said that he believes that Byron Buxton is willing to waive his no trade clause right now, and that he is willing to waive his no trade clause to teams outside of Atlanta. So it's not even a situation where he just wants to go back home to Georgia. He's willing to be traded elsewhere. So my initial thought from that is maybe Byron Buxton's had some conversations with the Twins baseball ops and they've said, well, we're probably not going to be contending. We're probably going to be tearing down the team more. We might not be the team for you going forward.
To me, this feels tremendously similar, albeit to a more off-season paced timeline, as the ending of Carlos Correa's tenure as a Minnesota Twin. He was still very stoic veteran leader in the clubhouse throughout the season as the ship started sinking, as it became more and more clear that the Twins needed to and likely were going to sell. And then within those last 3 games leading up to the deadline, and really even just in the 24 hours leading up to the deadline, everything switched on a dime. Correa talked with the front office, got a better picture of where they were headed, and said, "Get me out of here before it's too late." and albeit not happening in 1 week, that feels almost exactly like what is happening with Byron Buxton here right now.
Yeah, I agree. And with Buxton, it's tough too because he's a guy who spent his whole career in a Twins uniform. He's loved Minnesota. He said on multiple occasions he's a Twin for life, and he's also been very productive. I mean, we just talked about how the Twins have really a dearth of position player talent, and Byron Buxton put up 5 WAR as their everyday center fielder last year. And so it's tough to stomach trading Buxton. But on the other hand, he is, I think, 32, 33. He has 3 years, 45 million left on his contract. He's very tradable. You can get a good price for him, I'm sure. And if you're going to be further tearing it down, he's a guy that makes sense to move. It's just that if we get to that level where we're tearing it down truly to the studs and shipping out a guy who loves Minnesota and has been the perfect twin, really, it's just sad for the team.
We really start to feel like we're descending past just 1 or 2 years of being bad and rebuilding and into some of the truly lowest depths of the MLB. What this feels eerily similar to is what the Pirates have gone through recently, albeit with a much younger star, where Paul Skeens debuted, won Rookie of the Year, was a Cy Young finalist as a rookie, wins it in his second year, and people are already talking about him getting traded out of Pittsburgh because there's just no future for him there. And we've also seen Pittsburgh respond by supposedly offering some large deals to some large free agent names this offseason. So far, it hasn't worked. But if you stoop to a level like trading Byron Buxton, a man who has so clearly expressed his desire to be a twin for life, it goes back to dismantling any sort of progress you've built in terms of culture and leadership in the clubhouse. Because if Byron Buxton is on the table and is getting shipped out of Minnesota, nobody in the entire organization, from the major leagues to the Dominican complex, can feel remotely safe about their future in Minnesota.
Agreed. And if we're taking all of the emotion out of it, Buxton is a player who makes sense to trade. He's one of the oldest regulars on the roster. He has a ton of surplus value, but he's often injured. He's a little bit older than you would like, and he is making, I think, the second highest salary on the team behind Pablo. He's a guy who makes sense to trade, cash in on, and also, like we talked about, we have all of these outfielders, and we have a lot of guys who are center field capable. Alan Roden's played some center field. You don't love having him out there all the time, but Walker Jenkins and Emmanuel Rodriguez are both capable everyday center fielders. And you could even, if you're waiting for those two to come up, you could get by with kind of a Roden, Austin Martin, James Outman setup out there for this year. So it's a position of depth, but it would be tough to see him go. And honestly, I don't even know what you're looking to trade him for. At that point, it's probably just prospect capital where it doesn't really matter position. You're just getting the best players you can. But the Twins have young options everywhere except the infield. And so then if you're trading Buxton for purely a package of young infielders, well, where are you? You're kind of limiting who you can trade him to. And at that point, it's like you might as well just hold on to Buxton.
On top of that, if you're going to trade Byron Buxton this offseason, you're just kind of entering the point where you don't even know where you need talent on the roster anymore because you're offloading just as much as you're onboarding. And it makes it a lot tougher to have a clear picture of what direction the team is building in, not just for fans who aren't privy to all these conversations inside the organization, but as an organization as a whole. If you're going to take the time to trade away Byron Buxton, you're pretty much dismissing every other current major league asset they have as a guy that they don't see as a part of the future as a team to me, save for the very youngest guys on the roster, like a Luke Keeschel and maybe a Brooks Lee type of player.
Agreed. I mean, I'll believe it when I see it. It's definitely trending more in the direction of Buxton being available. I still think that This Twins front office hasn't shown a willingness to completely punt on a season. And so I think they'll roll into next year with Buxton still on the roster and probably at least one of their top starting pitchers around. But if they do decide to just blow it up, it could get really interesting. And I will say, if we go into next year having traded away Byron Buxton, Joe Ryan, and Pablo Lopez, now the team looks a lot different because those are three guys who will get significant hauls in return. We would have a wide open payroll going forward. Whether or not it actually gets spent, another question. But we would have a lot of young talent. We would have a wide open payroll, and you could at least dream on the team. But there's just so many question marks in that situation, and it's a team that in the present is nowhere near competing.
At the very least, if you trade all three of them, you finally have direction, something that the Twins have seemed to be lacking for most of the last year. And the other kind of benefit of it, as you mentioned, there's a certain upside to the Twins dealing all these guys at once because it kind of puts them in a massive power position in the trade market. I know Jeff Passan just recently did an article on the top trade targets or potentially available candidates this offseason. And the top 5 are all guys who are at best going to need to be a truly special offer to get dealt. It is Scooble, Ketel Marte, Freddie Peralta, and Hunter Green, all of which have not been even shopped by their clubs yet and are more just candidates that other teams would like to be able to buy if they could. And then 3 of the next 4 trade candidates on Passan's list are Byron Buxton, Joe Ryan, and Pablo Lopez. Meaning, if the Twins truly decide to launch all the way into a rebuild this year, they could theoretically be capitalizing themselves to once again be on top of the trade market through this offseason. And potentially, if they were going to be smart about this whole process and avoid a lot of the mistakes I personally feel they made at the deadline, use that power position to leverage teams against each other to maximize returns for all 3 of these guys.
Yeah, I will say, I don't know if this is true, but at the deadline, it kind of felt like the Twins flooded the market with relievers. They increased the supply by so much, adding 5 relievers to the trade market on top of the normal trade deadline relievers that are available, where I feel like that could have played into what were kind of thought as underwhelming returns. And so maybe that could happen again here. We already have heard that Mackenzie Gore is available. There's talks that Freddie Peralta could be available. Now, if you're adding all of the free agents that are available, we just saw Cease sign, but there's also Fromber, Ranger Suarez. There's a lot of interesting arms out there. For adding Pablo and Joe Ryan to that mix, there's a chance that we get to the territory where we have a lot of arms and less people that are willing to overpay for those arms. I'm not saying that we won't get a strong return because at any point, if you're trading a frontline starter, you're going to have teams that are willing to give up quite a bit to get them, but it's just not going to be a bowl you over kind of package. It might be market value.
And kind of building off of that idea as well, even if the Twins do end up dealing all of these guys, it's going to be very Twins-esque offseason where we're probably waiting until January and February to see these deals happen just because, as Matt mentioned, there's a already decent-sized starting pitching class in free agency that a lot of teams are already starting to pick at and feed on. And generally in the offseason, both for in general for the MLB, but also as the Twins approach the offseason, it's going to take a lot of those big names being cleared off the free agency board for other teams to pivot to the trade market. And to that extent, that is something the Twins should welcome because the longer they hold their guys, the smaller that market does get. Even if there's going to be fewer buyers in the market, those buyers are going to have significantly more elastic willingness to pay for their players. A lot of fancy econ terms that basically means they're going to be more willing to escalate their offers and make better offers because they're going to have less options.
The flip side of that is that A lot of the teams who would pay up for a starting pitcher early in the offseason might pivot by the time the Twins are willing to trade them. So we see this a lot with teams who would like to add a starting pitcher. They look around, they can't find a deal for one, and now they just go and add a big bat, or they sign a couple relievers. And now to the point where the Twins are going to trade one of these guys, that's less of an option for that player to get traded to because they've spent the money elsewhere, they've invested in other places in their roster, or they've made other deals to where they're not as willing to pay up. And even potentially without taking other options off the board. So, for example, the Red Sox have said that they are trying to stay below the luxury tax this year. It's widely thought that they have right around $21 million before hitting that luxury tax number. The expectation on the league is that they are now going to be looking to add a big bat. So they could, rather than trading for a Pablo Lopez, I'm sure they would have interest in now, if they go out and sign Alex Bregman instead, now they don't have the money to trade for a starter, even if they otherwise would have.
That is certainly a risk that you run, but I think if we're going to kind of try and tie all of this news together in a nice little bow, I think the fact that Byron Buxton so early and kind of abruptly into the offseason made it known that he's willing to push his no trade clause for more than Atlanta would suggest that the Twins are kind of starting these talks at the least, even if the deals don't come to fruition until January and February. There's sounding like there's a situation where the Twins are at least pushing these talks so teams know that if you strike out in the free agent market, instead of immediately pivoting to a different position in the free agent market, we are here, we are still listening, and we are still ready to be an immediate fallback option for those that don't find what they're looking for in free agency.
Yeah, I mean, it also makes sense that a lot of those teams might have already done a lot of their homework on the Twins guys. They were somewhat available at the deadline. We know Joe Ryan was. Pablo was hurt, and Buxton hadn't waived his. Well, he still hasn't, but he didn't have a willingness to waive his no trade clause. But it makes sense that teams have at least kicked the tires on those guys and would be more willing to jump in because they've probably been thinking about it for a while. I will say, I mean, we're only a few weeks into the offseason, and we've already seen the Blue Jays no longer willing to add a starting pitcher. They signed Dylan Cease a couple days ago, and then today they signed Cody Ponce. So now they have a million starting pitchers, and they're not going to be in the market for a guy like Joe Ryan. And then, as we talked about with the Red Sox, they already added Sonny Gray. And there's still room in their rotation if they wanted to add another starter, but it's looking like they're going to be spending that money elsewhere. Yeah, so those are two of the potential trade partners off the board for the Twins. Now we can look into each of these deals, being Sonny Gray and Dylan Cease, as a little bit of an insight into the value that we might have with Pablo and Joe Ryan. So for Sonny Gray, I don't know if it's super applicable because Sonny Gray is an older starting pitcher who's coming off of back-to-back pretty disappointing seasons. But the Cardinals did have to eat about $20 million on his deal. I believe he's making about $22 million now for the Red Sox. And the Red Sox gave up two interesting but not top prospects to get him. Again, that's on a one-year deal, somewhat expensive after being paid down. But for a guy who I would say is comfortably a tier two below Pablo and Joe Ryan. Dylan Cease, on the other hand, has been a little bit up and down, but gets strikeouts and is very durable. He's been dominant at times. He's struggled at times. Walks a few more guys than you'd like. His ability to throw a third good pitch is questionable, but he signed for 7 and 210 with the Blue Jays. Although with the deferrals in his deal, it's more like 7 and 182. But that to me signals a very strong market for Dylan Cease. So it makes me think that if that's what Dylan Cease is getting as a free agent, then 2 years and $43 million for Pablo, or 2 years and probably I don't know, 13, 14 million for Joe Ryan. Those are really fantastic deals, and someone would be willing to give up a lot in prospect value for them.
These deals certainly do paint a better picture when they come together in terms of what it means for the Twins. Because after the Sonny Gray trade, I was honestly a little bit concerned. As you mentioned, it was more underwhelming of a package than some might have expected, especially because of the significant portion of money that the Cardinals ate. But I think what we've seen with the ensuing deals for Cease, the bidding war, as well as even the Blue Jays being so forward to go out and add Ponce to an already very stacked starting pitching room, I think really shows the Sonny Gray trade as being more of a quirky trade in terms of just the concerns that Sonny Gray brings with him. Obviously, he has underlying metrics in terms of his rates as well as just the general speed of metrics on his pitches, where his stuff hasn't necessarily appeared diminished. He just has a very clear home run issue that I guess a lot of teams were buying into more strongly than I maybe would have thought of as just a fan of the game. But I do think that the Dylan Cease deal especially puts us closer to the ballpark of what the Twins would be dealing with for a trade market this season or this offseason.
Yeah, and I guess we'll see where some of these other free agents sign, what kind of deals they're looking at. I will say, talking about pitchers more broadly, I feel like the starting pitchers have gotten a little bit more money than I would expect, and the relievers have had kind of a bearish market. We just saw Devin Williams sign with the Mets, 3 years and 45 million. I thought he was probably going to get maybe a 4 year deal, maybe if someone really stretched a 5 year deal for a higher annual value than he signed for. And so I think that's a really good deal for the Mets and potentially a positive sign for the Twins. If that's what the top of the market's going to bear, then I would imagine that there will be a lot of interesting guys that are available for cheaper 1 and 2 year deals that the Twins could take a look at, assuming they're not blowing it up.
Yeah, I really looked the Ryan Helsley deal as the most interesting one out of, I guess, all the big moves you would say in the offseason so far for two reasons. I think first, the fact that a lot of teams were reportedly looking to try and transition him back into a starting pitching role says a lot about the continually increasing value of having a starting pitcher over a reliever. We saw the Mets do it to some success with Clay Holmes last season, but Ryan Helsley's less than half a year removed from being one of the most dominant closers in baseball. Even at the trade deadline, he was considered possibly the top trade piece in terms of present season value, even over Juan Duran. And so I think the fact that he had to settle for what ultimately is a 1 year prove it deal with Baltimore that has a second year added on for injury insurance. Obviously Helsley has a player opt out after the first season. So the general idea is similar to the Correa deal, where if Helsley goes to Baltimore, is their primary bulk closer and has another great season, he'll just hit the market next offseason with the market that he expected to have this offseason. But the fact that a player of Helsley's caliber had to settle for a deal at that level after a lot of teams were trying to move him into a starting pitching role this offseason, I think speaks volumes to where that kind of power and value dynamic sits in the MLB.
Yeah. Eno Saris of The Athletic had an interesting thing on Twitter. He said after the Helsley deal, he's like, well, 2 years is nothing. And he throws 100, which I think sometimes it is just that simple. He has great stuff. He's going to be a closer. He has a track record of success. And if it doesn't work out, it's still a pretty short term deal. So I like that as well for the Orioles. The Devin Williams one I thought was a fantastic bargain. He's a guy that I think would have he would have been looking at an upper an upper 8 figure, low 9 figure deal if he had his normal season. I think we could have seen him push over 100 million if he had another sub 2 ERA this year. He came into the season with a career 1.82 ERA, and then his underlying metrics weren't any worse with the Yankees than they were elsewhere. He still strikes everyone out. He hasn't walked that many guys. I think there's a real chance that he just goes back to being a dominant closer and one of the top relievers in baseball. And I think for the Mets in particular, giving him 3 years with no opt out is interesting because they have the kind of payroll space where if he just doesn't have it anymore, he's maybe a low end setup man now. He's not going to be a dominant closer. They can eat 15 million for just a bullpen guy. But if he's dominant, you have 3 years of a guy at a below market rate who's going to be a key piece in your success. And I think him not getting an opt out and taking a lower guarantee than he would have before last year gives a lot of upside to the Mets. And they're a team that can deal with the downside pretty easily.
It was definitely a fascinating deal from Williams' perspective. I know you touched on his underlying metrics. It's something that he spoke to at length after signing with the Mets about how he truly didn't feel like his numbers were any worse in 2025. And in some aspects, he felt like he even improved. And it's fascinating to hear him say that, for his agent to confirm that there were some clubs that felt the same way, and then for him to still end up with the deal that he did. Because to his credit, looking at his Baseball Savant page, he was in the 85th percentile or better still in expected ERA, expecting batting average, in the 97th or higher percentile in chase, whiff, and strikeout percentage, and above that 85% threshold in hard hit percentage. So he's not wrong. The numbers back him up that he was largely still operating as an elite reliever last season. And I think the fact that he was so willing to, like you said, not only settle into lower deal, but a lower deal without opt outs is a fascinating look at how he was ultimately viewed on the market versus how he felt he should be viewed, as well as, like you said, just a stellar deal for the Mets.
It also it makes it more interesting, the Twins trades at the deadline. I feel like it paints a brighter picture of the kind of value that the Twins got back for their arms. Because you think of Devin Williams compared to like a Joan Duran. Duran's making, I want to say, like 4 or 5 million this year. I would expect over the next 3 years, he's probably making 18 to 22 million. Well, that's about half of what Devin Williams is making, but that's only a $23 million difference. And Devin Williams at his peak is better than Duran. And Duran also has his own warning signs. His velo's gone down. He's still dominant. He still throws really hard. And his fastball is his third best pitch. But you could argue that, okay, if we take them as being the same level of player, all things equal, there's only $23 million in difference in payroll between the two. I would say that I would rather have Mick Abel and Eduardo Taiit than $23 million. So in that sense, it's a pretty good deal for the Twins. Also, I will say, I now that I'm thinking about it more, Duran's making like 4 to 5 this year, which is his second to last year of arbitration. So he'll probably make like 7 mil next year. Then you factor in like the 3 mil he made last year. It's like $15 million for the 3-ish years of control, which is like $30 million less. But even still, I would take Taiit and Mick Abel over $30 million.
I think that's a very spot on analysis. I don't think there's anything to disagree with there. I do think it's going to be curious to see how this affects player development for the Twins, with a lot of their guys being at AAA or kind of the quad A guys where they're ready to graduate to the MLB, but they haven't necessarily found a spot yet on the roster. I know in the past I've been a big advocate for maybe giving up on some of these starting pitching prospects early and getting them into the bullpen to get value out of them. But this is a good reminder still that even the most elite relievers are still going to be worth a fraction of what a good starter is worth because of the just number of innings they pitch. There's sheerly less volume they give you, which gives them less value. So I think it will be very interesting to see how the Twins handle a lot of these new guys coming into the organization that have questionable starting futures, because you have more reason to hold on to that hope for those guys longer.
Yeah, and I think the Twins now have so many starting pitching options to where they have a surplus they can deal from at a position that other clubs value highly. And so, to that extent, it makes sense for them to trade like a Pablo Lopez or a Joe Ryan, capitalize on the value that another team is willing to pay for them, and then have better backup options to backfill those spots than just about any other team in baseball. Um, Especially if you trade a guy like Pablo Lopez, you can clear that $20 million in salary and then use some of that money to add relievers. I think that makes it very interesting for the Twins in like present day value. Obviously, you're losing an all-star pitcher, but you can use him to both reinforce your bullpen in a weird roundabout way, but also bring back position or bring back hopefully position player, but just overall prospect value and give opportunities for your other arms to prove their value in the big leagues in a more valuable spot. It's kind of the same argument I would have made at the time of the Correa deal with Brooks Lee. Brooks Lee, as a second or third baseman, doesn't really have the bat to play there and is more of a good than great defender, and he's pretty slow. But if he can be a league average defensive shortstop, now the bat's pretty solid for a shortstop, and he becomes a much more valuable player. So I think trading Ryan or Lopez, especially if you don't expect to contend, gives you the opportunity to not only cash in on their value, excuse me, but also add value to the rest of your guys.
So we're going to switch gears here a little bit. I mentioned at the start of the pod that we both come from a pretty heavy economic backgrounds in our college studies. Matt has the MBA. I have a economics degree. And over the course of this last week, with the Dylan Cease deal being completed and him being kind of the first notable non Los Angeles Dodger to get a significant amount of deferral money on his contract, I wanted to really sit back and look at the bigger picture of where deferrals come from in the league, why they're being used so much more frequently now at the MLB level, and what this could potentially mean for the economic impact of baseball as we approach another, hopefully small, minor, itty bitty labor dispute, but certainly a labor dispute nonetheless entering this off season.
There's going to be a lockout.
It's going to be bad.
It's going to be awful.
I would brace for something worse than what we had in
21.
2021. Yes.
Yeah, the 21-22 off season.
Yep. So if we want to start with the beginning of deferred contracts in the MLB, from as far as I could find, as far as I could tell, the first deferred contract was Catfish Hunter in 1974, who was given $50,000 upfront in cash with $50,000 in insurance annuities, which is basically just a fancy way of saying we're going to use our insurance coverage to pay out your deferred payment. The annuity was not paid out in the very first year. Hunter went into a labor dispute with the Athletics and was ultimately released from his contract for an inability by the Athletics to pay out his deferred money. This, of course, was part of a much larger conversation on free agents at the time and ultimately did a lot of trailblazing for the deferred contracts we see today. One of the first notable deferred contracts, just in terms of appearing in a manner similar to what we're seeing today, was Bruce Sutter in 1984, who was paid $9.6 million over 6 years, which was certainly a very hefty contract back in 1984. And like I said, half that was paid out as a deferral, which ended up being a 1.12 million payment over the course of 30 years. That deal ended in 2022. And then, of course, we have arguably the most famous deferred contract, even though it was not originally signed as a deferred contract. Everybody knows him, everybody loves him. Bobby Bonilla having the remaining 5.9 million on his contract bought out by the Mets in 2000, which is why we now celebrate July 1st as Bobby Bonilla Day everywhere across baseball for the next 25 years. So until I believe 2035 that deal will be going on. He gets paid 1.19 million annually.
Yeah, and I think as Eric talked about, deferrals are becoming more of a hot button topic in baseball because of the success of the Dodgers recently. They've been pretty open about their use of deferrals. Obviously, the most famous one being Shohei Ohtani making $2 million a year for the next decade, and then $68 million a year for 10 years after that. But they also doubled down. They have a bunch of deferred money on Freddie Freeman. They gave Will Smith like a 10 or 13-year deal as a catcher as purely a way to spread out the money on his deal. Nobody expects him to still be playing or still be a high level contributor at the end of that deal. They've just done a lot of contracts that are spreading money out over time. And I think the reason that they're doing this is to reduce the luxury tax hit that they're taking right away. Teams are, when you pay a guy up front and you're over the luxury tax, you're paying the whole tax number. So for Shohei, right? If he was just making $70 million this year, they would be paying the tax on 70 million, which I don't have the CBA in front of me, but it's a lot of money. It would be, I think it's 30%. So it'd be like $23 million a year that they're just paying in tax money. That's not going to their roster. It's not going anywhere. It's just going to baseball as a whole. So what they do is they add these deferred years on, or they make a contract longer. It reduces the calculated average annual value of the deal. It reduces their number to the luxury tax, and then it allows them to pay less money in taxes and just spread the money out over time. Now, the downside is in 10 years, Shohei's retired, whatever, his contract's over. They're now paying the luxury tax still on Shohei because they have those deferred years. So it reduces their ability to spend in the future, theoretically. But I think the bet the Dodgers are making is that A, the luxury tax will go up by enough that in 10 years, this money that we have committed to these players will be lessened. Or B, we'll have an entirely different system to where we don't have to care about the luxury tax implications and we just save $20 million a year on tax payments.
So this all sounds like an absolute slam dunk, fantastic deal for the Dodgers. You can understand why a lot of teams are also starting to dip their toes into this pool. And you ask yourself, why is this not a bigger deal in the MLB? Why isn't everybody doing this? Why is it, in Andrew Friedman, the Dodgers GM's own words, more of a cherry on top, kind of that last push when the Dodgers have been maybe 40, 50 million away in total money from the player side, the little push they use to get over the top. And I believe it's twofold. First of all, as Matt said, there are a lot of ramifications down the future for a team that not a lot of teams can stomach, like the Dodgers. But it also has to do with the current wording and ruling of the CBA, which is that for a team to create a deferred contract, and this goes back to the Catfish Hunter issue, even if they're not paying it out right now, even if they're paying Shohei out over the course of 30 years, at all times they need to have proof of cash in the bank totaling the amount of deferred money that is owed to the player, so that if something goes south, if the team goes bankrupt for whatever reason, this player can be assured that they're still going to get their money, which means for the Dodgers, who currently have 1.006 billion, so over $1 billion sank into deferred deals, their ownership group at all times has to be able to put up $1 billion in cash to back these deferred payments. And that right there is where we get into the massive chasm between the economics of these Dodgers and Yankees and Mets teams versus a team like the Twins. The operating owners of the Dodgers, the Guggenheim Group, are valued at $322 billion. That is an astronomical number, even in comparison to another MLB owner like the Polads. That makes it almost impossible for most of the lower market teams to be able to put forward this type of deferred money. And finally, a question I've been pondering, I'd be very curious to hear your thoughts on. It has long term ramifications in a league that is looking very heavily towards expansion and also has almost a half dozen teams that are in some sorts of talk for either relocation or sale of the team. And I can't help but feel that having deferred money, significant deferred money, especially on the books, would be a massive burden to a team looking to sell. And I think that might be an explanation for why the Padres, who traditionally have been big spenders as of late, are not trying to keep up in the competition with the Dodgers.
Yeah, I think really this just highlights how big of a competitive advantage the Dodgers have in the current system. They're able to really flex their financial firepower that they know pretty much no other team in baseball can match. I think from a competitive advantage standpoint, it's the single biggest advantage that any team in baseball has, and it's not even close. And I don't know that it's necessarily an issue for most of the league. I think a lot of teams are a little bit wary of deferred contracts for the same reasons that Eric just laid out. But I think it's going to become more of an issue where teams are trying to figure out how to remain competitive with the Dodgers when they don't have those same resources. And it might get into a really tricky topic in the next CBA. But the problem is, I don't know who's going to be arguing for this because for the players, they're completely fine with deferred contracts, whatever is going to give them more money. They're good with the Dodgers spending all this money, deferring all this money because it means that their players are getting paid the most. Sure, players would love a perfectly competitive league where every team has an equal chance to win every year. But in reality, they care most about the money. And the owners, yeah, they want they want to be able to compete with the Dodgers, but it's also not, I don't think, a front of mind issue so much that there's going to be infighting between the owners to make rule changes to significantly hurt pretty much just the Dodgers. So I don't know that there's a good solution for this or that one is coming in the next CBA, but it's something that's definitely raising tensions across the league and doesn't have a clear solution.
I think a fascinating addition to this conversation, as we've talked about how it might be addressed in future labor disputes, is how this mechanism could interact with a potential salary either floor or cap that is going to certainly be one of at the forefront of conversations during this labor dispute. And it's a pattern that I think we've been seeing for generations in baseball, where this is an idea that is known to have originated within the owners that certainly benefits the owners significantly more than it does the players. Not saying that it doesn't benefit the players, but at the end of the day, this Dylan Cease deal is in the ballpark in terms of present value as what he was already expected to get in the offseason. And I think that's where a lot of these players are getting tripped up right now is they don't necessarily have the strong economic background, not that I blame them, to be able to look at a $300 million deal and say, okay, but that doesn't matter because the present value of this deal is only 180 million, which is something that I was already going to get on the free agent market. And I think that as soon as the owners are able to lock in a potential salary cap in combination with this deferral process, I think that's when we're going to start seeing potentially massive issues. In the past, they've just kind of papered over these larger issues by giving us very specific solutions. For example, I think the first one that comes to mind is what's commonly known as the Cohen tax, which was just another addition to the luxury tax after Steve Cohen bought the Mets. But I think that there's a lot of potential long-term conflicts with this way that the state of the MLB is headed economically, that I think the owners are a lot further ahead on considering than the players or the player union.
Yeah. I'll also say, I think as an industry, they need to recognize the opportunity cost of having to hold all of that money in cash for the team's perspective, because while they're saving, so each team is going to act rationally in their own best interest, theoretically. So each team is operating in a way that will save them the most money. So, how they're doing that currently is by reducing their payments to Major League Baseball. And the downside for that is that they have to keep that money in cash for the deferred contracts. Now, while that money is in cash, it's not making them any money. They can't invest it elsewhere. They can't even put it into like a mutual fund or a bond market. They can't do anything with it. It's cash. So they need to be in a situation where the money they're losing by not being able to invest the money for the deferrals is greater than the money that they would have had to spend and pay to MLB in order to be over the luxury tax by whatever amount. So each team is making these deferrals and doing whatever, and they're saving some amount of money by just letting their money sit and not paying it to Major League Baseball. But as an industry as a whole, you would rather that money just go to Major League Baseball, and the team is investing all of their available resources at all times so that the industry as a whole is making more money and you're not having a lost economic profit. So, from an industry as a whole perspective, you'd prefer to have no deferred contracts, and any money over the tax is just going to Major League Baseball, because that's the situation where the industry as a whole is making the most money possible. But right now, it's not set up to incentivize teams to do that. And so they're not. And this is where I wonder if Major League Baseball itself will kind of lobby for a rule change here and try to get the owners on board by helping them see that if we don't have deferred contracts, it benefits us all economically and really only hurts the Dodgers. It doesn't hurt them all that much because I don't know how much money they're really saving by deferring the money, and they can just theoretically make it in other investments.
So I see the point on this money being functionally dead money to teams in terms of them not being able to reinvest it elsewhere, not just in terms of baseball, but for their business as a whole. But to me, it functionally just acts as a piece of collateral to be able to sign these contracts. It's no different than me being able to sign a certain level of mortgage or take out a certain level of loan because I have X amount of assets that I can put up as collateral if that loan goes south. And I think that's where this becomes a potentially really concerning issue for the MLB, but also has really interesting interactions with a potential salary cap. Because as of right now, there's essentially no limit to the amount of collateral you can put up as a team for a player. So in this hypothetical market, I might be able to afford to put up my Xbox as collateral for a player. My parents can put up an entire house as collateral for a player, and therefore they're going to be able to have even more agency because we're now not just talking about spending ability in our current day and year and current set of contracts. We're talking about spending ability for decades, for lengths of times that these players won't even see. That means that the Dodgers theoretically can continue to accumulate deferred money, deferred contracts, and just continue to use a combination of inflating luxury taxes and the general idea of inflation to never see the cost and the punishment of all the deferred deals that they're creating. However, if the MLB were to come and retroactively, well, not retroactively, even if they just add a salary cap starting this offseason, you are now hooking these teams, most notably the Dodgers, that already have the significant amount of money spent, because you are now putting a limit on the amount of collateral essentially that they can put up for signing players in the present day, where they would reach a point if they already have $1 billion allotted in deferred payments over the course of the next 20 years, that they simply could not mathematically afford to add more deferred payments because they still have to have operating room for those future years of baseball.
Yeah, I think the salary cap issue is interesting. I personally am of the belief that the players will never agree to it. They won't agree to anything that's specifically called a salary cap, and it'll just be a pseudo cap, kind of in the way that the luxury tax works, where it's a lot of, like, I don't want to say sanctions, but like a lot of non-firm rules that influence how clubs operate to stay below kind of a target number. I do think it's very interesting the point you bring up about deferred money becoming a significant part of a team's value. So if you take the Twins, for example, they just sold some amount of their ownership stake. Theoretically, hasn't gone through yet. That's a whole nother thing. But they just sold some amount of their ownership stake at a $1.7 billion valuation. Now, if you take the $680 million that Shohei Ohtani has in deferred money that has to sit in cash, that is 40% of the Twins' franchise value that would have to be in cash for them to sign Shohei Ohtani. They don't have 40% of their franchise value in cash. In fact, they are like 30% of the franchise's value in debt that they're paying interest on. So what this does is it just makes such a financial divide between the haves and the have-nots that the Twins have no shot at ever competing anywhere near the level of the Dodgers, because they couldn't afford that deal if they wanted to. And I don't mean in a we can't afford it because we're not going to spend money in the way that the Poleheads usually can't afford things. They physically could not afford it. They'd have to sell half of the team to Shohei Ohtani. They'd be like, you get half of the Minnesota Twins if you play here for 10 years. And no team will ever do that. So it does just create a giant divide. And if a team like the Twins were to extend themselves to go after not even a Shohei, but even if you gave Kyle Tucker $400 million and 380 of it's deferred, that's still so much of your franchise's value that now it gets into an issue of, are we going to be solvent? Are we possible, like as a business, are we going to survive this massive expenditure in a way that we don't see with sports teams? Sports teams print money, and all of their issues, all of their payroll restrictions are really fake problems. It's just limits that they impose on themselves based on how much profit do we want to make. If we get deep down the rabbit hole of deferred money, it could get to the point where sports teams have actual liquidity and like solvency issues, and they could like actually be in dire financial straits.
Adding on to that portioning of Shohei's deferred money in the view of the total valuation of the Twins, I mentioned earlier that the Dodgers have over $1 billion in total deferred money out right now to their players. The entire Pohlad family has a net worth of only $3.8 billion, which means that for the Twins to do what the Dodgers have done over the last 5 years with these deferred deals, they would have to functionally sell every asset that is not the Minnesota Twins in order to solidify their net value to be able to make these types of deals. That is the level of just absurdity at both which the Dodgers are operating, and these deferred payments have an opportunity to mess with the state of the league.
The solution to this that I could see happening, and that I think actually solves the root problem here, isn't necessarily a salary cap, because I don't think the players would agree to it. But I think just a ban on deferred contracts makes a lot of sense. Really, the only team that's hurting is the Dodgers and like maybe the Mets, like the true big dogs in the free agent market, like the absolute financial powerhouses. It's the only people that's hurting. For the players, you're just getting more present value. Well, you're getting really the same value in the long term, and you're just getting paid more of it up front, which players generally want. And so it doesn't necessarily hurt them financially. It only hurts the Dodgers, and it takes out a big risk for the league as a whole and potentially improves parity by making everyone play by the same luxury tax rules. It's a rule change that I would love to have happen. We'll see if it has any real proponents, anyone who's really pushing it through. But I think that's something that could come out of the next CBA. But again, I don't know. Like every rule change, every issue needs one group who feels very strongly about it and is willing to bang their fist on the table and push for change. And I don't know that we have anyone who feels that strongly about it to push for the outlaw of deferred contracts.
I agree on that front, but it goes back to what I've talked about is a decades-long issue of the players union being just generally behind the owners in terms of economic thinking in these CBA negotiations, where it's something that's a blip on our radar right now and something that I think we both agree could become a massive issue in a decade as we're reworking the CBA, and something that I can assure you at the least the owners are already starting to think about, and it's something that is very likely not even on the players' radar right now, as it's something that has only been viewed as a benefit to them.
Yeah, I can also see, like, if you're a player, right, and you think you're worth 200 million and a club thinks you're worth 180 million, I could see the player signing a $205 million deal, but 25 million of it's deferred. So they're like, yes, I signed a $205 million deal. That's more than I wanted. But really, economically, it's like a lot closer to, I don't know, 190 million. It's closer to the owner's side. It's kind of a compromise. The player gets to feel good. The ownership side gets to feel good. Everyone's happy. I think where it becomes a problem is when the majority of the contract is being deferred, a la Shohei Ohtani. And that's really just a clear example of them gaming the system more than anything. It's not the cherry on top, as Andrew Friedman referred to it. It's not a negotiating tactic. It's not a little thing to get a deal done and get closer to a compromise. This is now, we are strategically going to structure our contracts to avoid paying this tax. And that's an entirely different issue. So if we don't want to outright ban deferred contracts, I could see a situation where they're like, you can't defer more than 5% of your contract's total worth or 10% of your contract's total worth. And that way, it's a tool that gets to remain in the tool bags of both the players and the ownership side in these negotiations, but it's not going to allow teams to game the system.
I really like that concept as a potential CBA adjustment to how deferred contracts work. I've also been sitting over here trying to think on my own solution, because who wants all this negative and doomsday foreseeing news without at least a potential positive solution? I hearken my idea back to actually NFL economics, which is vastly different because they do not guarantee entire contracts, unlike baseball or the NBA. So we're going to only dip our toes in. But to me, I look at the concept of dead money on NFL contracts and how that has become a revolution recently, in which teams are restructuring the terms of deals, turning guaranteed salary into signing bonuses so they can push that money into future years, and it ultimately sits on their salary cap in those future years as what people call dead money that has to be spent, has to go towards the salary cap, cannot be adjusted, but is being paid to a player that's no longer on the team. So
Shout out the
my
New Orleans Saints, the
shout
dead
out the
cap
New Orleans
legends.
Saints. My idea in how this could be addressed at the MLB level is to essentially start treating deferred money as dead cap, and then taxing the ever living hell out of that dead cap, saying that whether it's all dead cap or just again any money spent over a luxury tax towards the dead cap, it could be structured either way, but basically significantly devaluing the value of deferred contracts from a team perspective by forcing them to pay back into the league on top of paying just to the player in that year. It would address one of the primary concerns you brought up about teams essentially gaming the system, lowering the amount of money they're paying into the league as a whole. And I think it would be something that would allow deferred contracts to continue to exist in that small operating region, like you suggested, where at most like 5 to 10% of a deal would come in as deferred money, but it would still allow for an area where deferred deals can exist, but aren't just as blatantly lucrative as something like the Shohei Otani deal.
Yeah, I think all of this conversation is natural. Like I feel like every league goes through something like this. I think what's causing this is just the implementation of a luxury tax. Prior to that, baseball had no semblance of a cap, whether it's a hard cap or a soft cap, like the luxury tax. There was no reason to have salaries or contracts structured differently. But now adding the cap introduces a whole department of baseball people whose only job is going to be finding a way around that cap. It's the same as every billionaire and their accountants. It's the same as every multinational corporation. They don't want to pay taxes. They want a competitive advantage, and they will find a way around your rules for their own benefit, no matter what. And so the reason that in like the NBA we have a maximum number of years that a player can get on a contract is that you can't spread out their cap hit over a bunch of years. I think the Dodgers are understanding that they might not be able to have deferred money in the future, but who's to say that they don't think it's a good investment to have Will Smith for the next 10 years? Yeah, he's a catcher, but they can catch at 40. It's fine. We'll give him an extension. And right now, baseball has no guardrails in place to say you can't give a guy a contract for X number of years long. And I mean, honestly, we've seen this even before the Dodgers with both Manny Machado. Well, not with Manny Machado. Manny Machado signed a 10-year deal for $300 million. Bryce Harper signed a 13-year deal for $330. And the understanding is that Bryce Harper could have signed for 10 years and $330. He chose to make it 13 to lower his luxury tax number because I mean nobody's expecting him to be playing in 13 years, but he can lower the number so that while he is playing, the team can be better built around him. Baseball doesn't have any mechanism to limit the number of years on a player's contract, and that allows the team to essentially defer money by just making a player's contract longer than they actually expect the player to be valuable for. Now, if you are going to limit the number of years, it's going to be an even bigger fight with the players because the players aren't going to want to do anything that could potentially limit their earning capacity, and years is one of the main things they're fighting for in negotiations. Yes, they care about AAV, but they also want a number of years where they're getting paid at a high AAV. So if you say you can't sign a deal longer than 5 years, hurts their earning capability. So it's just going to be a fist fight. I think that's where we're getting to. Owners and players are going to be pissed at each other and it's just going to be a train wreck until this gets resolved, and I don't know when or how it'll get resolved.
So, kind of putting a bow on this as we get close to wrapping up on our pod here, I think it's fascinating that we feel compelled to talk about this already when, as we mentioned, this likely will not be addressed in the CBA this offseason. This is not really an issue that a lot of people feel strongly about, and it's not something that we're likely to see a resolution on anytime soon. And to me, that is what makes the economics behind sports infinitely more fascinating than any sort of other economics you're going to study, because unlike world trade, local market economics, government inefficiencies, you can't be fluid in the way your league is operating. The government, albeit having its own issues with operating efficiently, can at any time make a policy proposal, a policy change, a change to the way our country is structured to affect the economics of the country. We need, in my opinion, to start talking about this right now, because after this CBA that happens this offseason, they might not talk economics or anything regarding that in baseball for another 5-10 years, hopefully. And that's why these teams are currently willing and able to exploit these loopholes and do so to such an extreme manner in terms of both money and years, because they're able to operate knowing roughly what their financial landscape will look like for the next decade plus, which is a luxury that you're not going to find in almost any other market ever.
This is our modern equivalent to Moneyball. I mean, the Oakland A's won because they could better understand the value of players. The Dodgers are winning because they're better able to leverage their financial might to compete than the rest of the league. They have a smart front office. They make good baseball decisions. They're also able to leverage what they do really well to help their team on the field. And so I think at the end of the day, you have to look at what the Dodgers have done as impressive. They thought ahead of everyone else. They were able to use their unique strengths to help build as good of a roster as you could possibly imagine. But it's also a rough look for the sport. And it's something that as a fan, especially a fan of a smaller market team, you should want to not see in the game. You want it to be competitive. You want every team to have a chance. But at the same time, I mean, it's a really impressive way of structuring their team to beat the rules of the system by that front office.
I do really love that Moneyball comparison, because you're spot on, correct, that this is just the anti-Moneyball beginning to form. So if you're a sicko out there, loves Moneyball, watches it all the time, is not rooting for the A's in the movie, this one's for you. But maybe look in the mirror first.
All right. Well, we'll be back next week. We're on kind of a consistent schedule now. We are dropping every Wednesday morning. As always, we are on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube at Matt and Eric Talk Twins. We're also on Twitter, so you can see us posting there. I think as we get some more news and notes this offseason, we'll be posting some of our thoughts and initial reactions on Twitter before the podcast. So if you want to know right away, you can follow our Twitter page and see those reactions. But until next week, thank you for tuning in.